Close your eyes and imagine a long, sterile hospital corridor. The scent of pure antiseptic clings to every breath you take. You hear the rhythmic, steady click of polished leather shoes against a pristine stone floor. There is a strange comfort in the order of science, a belief that the hands holding the scalpel are the guardians of life itself. But in the biting cold of Manchuria in the 1930s, that belief was a hollow abyss. Under the snow-white coats of Unit 731, a heartbeat was not a sign of life, but a variable to measure how long it takes for a soul to fracture. Here, the laboratory was not a temple of progress, but a factory where the human body was disassembled with the cold indifference of a broken machine. The sun rose every day over the chimneys of Pingfang, but for those inside, the light only brought the terror of being seen. They were no longer human beings. They were variables in a dark equation that the world once tried to forget. Inhale deeply, for the archives are open and the air is about to turn very cold. To understand the darkness of Unit 731, one must first understand the fever that gripped the Japanese Empire in the early 20th century. Japan was a nation transformed, a feudal society that had modernized at a breakneck pace to match the industrial giants of the West. By the 1930s, this ambition had curdled into a radical, ultra-nationalist ideology known as Hakko Ichiu, or the belief that the emperor was destined to rule the 8 corners of the world. In 1931, the Imperial Japanese Army staged the Mukden Incident as a pretext to invade Manchuria, carving out a puppet state they called Manchukuo. This vast, occupied territory became the playground for the Kwantung Army, a force that operated with almost total autonomy from the civilian government in Tokyo. In this lawless frontier, the constraints of international treaties and human morality were viewed as weaknesses to be discarded. The Japanese leadership realized that they could not win a prolonged war of attrition against the Soviet Union or the United States through traditional steel and lead alone. They needed a miracle weapon, a force that could bypass the trenches and the battlefields to strike at the very heart of civilian populations. They found their architect in a man named Shiro Ishii, a brilliant but chillingly immoral military doctor who argued that biological warfare was the supreme weapon of the future. Ishii convinced the High Command that while the West viewed germ warfare as a taboo, Japan could use it to achieve a total divine victory. With the blessing of the emperor's inner circle, Ishii was given an unlimited budget and a vast tract of land near the village of Pingfang. The stage was set for the most systematic industrialization of human suffering in the history of the world. Shiro Ishii was not a simple soldier. He was a man of high intellect and profound arrogance. He was known for his flamboyant lifestyle, his heavy drinking, and his absolute conviction that the laws of man did not apply to men of science. Ishii viewed the human body not as a sacred vessel, but as a biological machine that could be disassembled and studied like a clock. He recruited the brightest minds from Japan's most prestigious universities, Kyoto and Tokyo Imperial, promising them a chance to push the boundaries of medical science without the interference of ethics committees. These doctors, many of whom would later become leaders of Japan's medical establishment, were seduced by the promise of unlimited research subjects. They arrived at Pingfang dressed in pristine white coats, walking through a facility that looked more like a modern hospital than a prison. Ishii created a cult of personality within the unit, fostering a culture of clinical detachment where the victims were no longer referred to as human beings. They were called maruta, or logs, a term born from the cover story that the facility was merely a lumber mill. By dehumanizing the prisoners, Ishii ensured that his staff could perform the most heinous acts with the same emotional weight as a carpenter sawing a piece of wood. The cruelty of Unit 731 was not born of rage or heat-of-the-moment violence. It was a cold, calculated, and intellectualized evil. The complex at Pingfang was a marvel of brutalist architecture and logistical efficiency. Spanning 6 square kilometers and consisting of over 150 buildings, it was a self-contained city of death. It featured laboratories, massive incinerators, a dedicated railway line, and even an airfield for the deployment of biological weapons. At its heart was Building 7 and Building 8, the prison blocks where the Maruta were kept in cramped windowless cells. The air in the hallways was a thick, stagnant cocktail of carbolic acid, rotting flesh, and coal smoke from the ever-running furnaces. The facility was designed with a one-way flow. Prisoners entered through the gates, but they only left through the chimneys as gray ash. Ishii's staff lived in luxury within the compound, enjoying cinemas, bars, and brothels, while only yards away, human lives were being systematically destroyed. This juxtaposition of domestic normalcy and industrial slaughter is what makes Unit 731 uniquely haunting. The doctors would spend their days vivisecting children and their evenings sipping sake and discussing poetry. For them, the screams from the prison blocks were merely the background noise of progress. The prisoners of Unit 731 were a diverse collection of the Empire's disposables. They were Chinese resistance fighters, Russian civilians fleeing the revolution, Korean nationalists, and even Allied prisoners of war. The Kempeitai, Japan's dreaded secret police, would sweep through occupied cities and round up anyone who looked suspicious or lacked proper documentation. Once they arrived at Pingfang, their names were deleted from all records. Pregnant women, infants, and the elderly were all considered valuable subjects for different types of research. The doctors were particularly interested in how diseases like syphilis or the plague would affect various demographics. They would infect mothers and then perform vivisections on their unborn fetuses to see if the bacteria had crossed the placental barrier. They would purposely underfeed some prisoners to study the effects of extreme malnutrition, while overfeeding others to see how a healthy body reacted to toxic injections. The Maruta were kept in a state of perpetual terror, never knowing when the door to their cell would open for the last time. When a prisoner became too weak to be useful, they were expended in a final, lethal experiment to ensure that no part of their life was wasted without being documented. One of the most documented and gruesome series of experiments focused on the limits of the human body in extreme cold. The Imperial Army anticipated a war in the frozen Siberian wilderness and needed to know how to treat frostbite among its troops. The field research involved marching prisoners out into the sub-zero Manchurian night. They were stripped naked, and their limbs were sprayed with water until they were encased in a thick layer of ice. The doctors would periodically strike the frozen hands or feet with short wooden clubs. If the limb made a dull, hollow thud like a piece of frozen wood, the stage of frostbite was deemed sufficient. The victims were then taken back inside for rewarming tests. Some limbs were placed in lukewarm water, while others were thrust directly into boiling water. The results were catastrophic. In the boiling water tests, the skin and muscle would delaminate from the bone in a single sickening piece, leaving behind a white, skeletal structure. The doctors would record the process with high-speed cameras, noting the exact temperature at which the flesh became unviable. If a prisoner survived the initial frostbite, they were often subjected to it again and again until the gangrene became so advanced that their limbs simply fell off. Unit 731 was not limited to biology. It explored the very physics of human destruction. In the decompression chambers, the doctors sought to understand the effects of high-altitude flight. A prisoner would be sealed inside a steel tank while the air was slowly pumped out. The doctors watched through a reinforced portal as the victim's body began to fail. The first sign was the bulging of the eyes as the internal pressure pushed against the sockets. Next, the blood vessels in the skin would rupture, turning the victim a deep, bruised purple. In the final stages, the pressure would become so intense that the lungs would collapse and the intestines would be forced out of the body through the rectum. Ishii's staff also experimented with massive centrifuges. They would strap a human being into a spinning chair and rotate them at incredible speeds until the brain was literally crushed against the skull by G-forces. They wanted to know how much centrifugal force a pilot could withstand before their internal organs liquefied. Other experiments involved tying prisoners to stakes at various distances from a central point where a fragmentation bomb would be detonated. The doctors would then count the number of shrapnel wounds and the depth of penetration, using living people to calibrate the lethality of their ordnance. The pinnacle of the horror at Pingfang was the vivisection. Ishii believed that the use of anesthesia, ether or chloroform, distorted the biological results of an autopsy. He demanded that his surgeons see the organs in their natural, functioning state. This meant that thousands of vivisections were performed on prisoners who were fully awake. The victim would be strapped to a porcelain table, their mouth gagged to prevent them from biting through their tongue. The surgeon would make a long, deep incision from the throat to the pelvis. As the skin was peeled back, the doctor would narrate the state of the organs into a recorder. They would remove the stomach and sew the esophagus directly to the intestines to see if the body could still process nutrients. They would remove sections of the brain while the victim was still blinking, testing which motor functions were lost as each piece was cut away. Sometimes they would amputate an arm and sew it onto the opposite shoulder to see if the nerves would reattach. The screams were described by survivors of the staff as a high-pitched whistling that would eventually fade into a wet, rattling gurgle. The victims were kept alive as long as possible, sometimes for hours, while the doctors explored their interior. When the heart finally stopped, the body was tossed into the incinerator, and the table was hosed down for the next log. As the war in the Pacific turned against Japan, Ishii became desperate to field-test his biological weapons. He developed the Uji-type bomb, a porcelain shell that was designed to break open at a specific altitude. Inside were millions of fleas, raised on the blood of plague-infected rats and mixed with contaminated grain. The grain was intended to attract local rats, which would then spread the fleas and the bacteria throughout the human population. Japanese aircraft flew sorties over Chinese cities like Ningbo and Chongde, dropping their silent cargo. The residents had no idea they were being attacked until the first buboes appeared. The bubonic plague, the Black Death, was reborn in the 20th century. Villages were wiped out in weeks. Ishii sent epidemic prevention teams into the infected areas. Dressed in heavy rubber suits and masks, they did not come to heal. They came to collect samples. They would enter the homes of the dying, dragging them into the streets to perform autopsies while their families watched in horror. They wanted to see if the lab-grown strain was as virulent as the one they had studied in the prison blocks. It was. Thousands of Chinese civilians died in agony, their lungs filling with fluid and their skin turning black, all so Shiro Ishii could refine his miracle weapon. By August of 1945, the dream of the Greater East Asia Co-Prosperity Sphere was a smoking ruin. The Soviet Red Army had declared war on Japan and was surging across the Manchurian border. Ishii knew that if the Soviets captured Pingfang, the world would see the true face of his research. He received a direct order from the Imperial High Command: destroy everything. The remaining 400 prisoners in Buildings 7 and 8 were herded into the gas chambers and killed with potassium cyanide. Their bodies were piled into the incinerators and burned until only fine, white powder remained. The laboratory equipment was smashed, and the massive concrete buildings were rigged with tons of dynamite. The explosions shook the earth for miles, reducing the most sophisticated biological research center in the world to a field of jagged rubble. Ishii fled on a private train, clutching a suitcase filled with his most precious data, microfilm records of every vivisection, every frostbite test, and every plague field test. He told his staff that they were to take their secrets to the grave. He warned them that if any of them spoke, he would find them and kill them. The men of Unit 731 vanished into the chaos of the collapsing empire, carrying the ashes of thousands on their hands. The final chapter of Unit 731 is perhaps the most bitter. As the American occupation of Japan began, the U.S. military realized that Ishii possessed information that no other nation had. The data on human experimentation was considered priceless by the American biological warfare experts at Fort Detrick. They argued that because the United States was a democracy, they could never perform these experiments themselves. Therefore, they had to acquire Ishii's data to ensure that the Soviet Union did not get it first. A secret deal was struck. General Douglas MacArthur's administration granted full immunity from prosecution to Shiro Ishii and the entire leadership of Unit 731. In exchange, they handed over their microfilms and their research ledgers. The men who had vivisected children and poisoned cities were never brought to the Tokyo War Crimes Tribunal. They were never called to account for the Maruta. Instead, they were integrated into the new Japan. Some became the founders of major pharmaceutical companies like Green Cross. Others became the heads of Japan's medical associations and even served on the committee for the 1964 Tokyo Olympics. Shiro Ishii died in his bed of throat cancer in 1959, a wealthy man who had successfully traded the lives of thousands for his own comfort. The truth of Unit 731 remained hidden for decades, buried under a mountain of classified documents and Cold War pragmatism. The ashes of history were scattered to the wind, but the soil of Pingfang remains, forever stained by the memory of the logs that once were men.